So yeah, I wanted to have a bit of a panel discussion with these guys because they've raised some topics in a few talks, and I'll introduce them. Well, maybe get you to introduce yourselves, actually. We'll start from Cos. You can do it again if you want.
I just spoke.
Yep, there you go.
Hi, I'm Carl. I'm a Java developer. You should pull this forward. Awesome.
Can you hear okay, the speakers? Speak up a bit if you can, guys. Yep.
Awesome. I'm Damien. I work for Microsoft. That's about all I'm going to say right now.
And I think you all know Phil as well. I'll get him away with it. So I wanted to start off because both Phil and Cos talked about open source and contributing to open source. And we don't, the way I look at it, we don't expect accountants and lawyers to go home and get excited and do some more accounting for their friends when they get home. But we expect it. We seem to think that to be a good developer, you have to contribute to open source. So I wanted to ask the panel, do you think it's compulsory to contribute to open source to be a good developer? Who's going to jump in?
I think that's definitely not true, but I think that the good accountants do seem to always be thinking about accounting things, and they're the sort of guys that are thinking about business things in the weekend. They're talking about things with people. They're going to groups, and I think that the same is true for developers. That it's not where you're contributing, it's that you're doing it. I don't know whether raising the 10,000 hours thing is when you lose the conversation, but it seems that just doing that practice is the right thing to do. It's not necessarily just open source.
Yeah, and actually the idea that accountants or like doctors and lawyers don't do anything else, it's actually they have this term, I forget the exact term, but it's continuing education requirements.
Continuous improvement.
Yeah, so they're actually required by their license, by their whatever their profession to do this stuff. Software is not really a profession in the same vein as those professions, so we don't have any such requirements, right? It's all driven by the market. I think contributing to open source is a great way to burnish skills that you might not get from the workplace, and it's certainly a good thing to do, but I think there are many great developers who are not open source contributors.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's necessarily a requirement, as you said, if you don't contribute to open source, you're not adding value, or you're not going to be a good programmer. I think that's kind of like a fun troll position to take on the issue. But I think there's also kind of a misunderstanding of how most open source work does. So, I mean, I don't sit down and do a whole bunch of paid work during the day, and then when I get to the end of the day, all right, now I'm going to start doing the open source work that I do. The contributions that I make tend to be coming out of the actual day-to-day stuff that I'm doing. So I'm fixing bugs that I've found in the framework, or I'm adding a feature that it would have been nice if I had it when I was trying to do that initial development. And so it doesn't actually involve going home and then doing a whole bunch of additional programming. It just involves actually being focused on improving your tools and improving your community in your day-to-day work. Now, some people work for companies that don't allow that kind of thing. Get another job is kind of my advice. Lots of people are hiring.
I'll ask another question in a sec, but we're also going to take questions from the floor. So Ian's at the back there with a microphone. So if you have a question you want to ask this group, throw your hand up. Any questions yet?
So that seems quite true, and I guess that's something that is special about open source, is that when something is wrong, that you are able to instead say, "Oh, this is broken." You are actually able to get in there and fix it, and so that does give open source kind of a special quality. And it also, if you don't have a project that you particularly want to work on yourself, then there are thousands of projects that really do value your time. So I guess that does make it a pretty good candidate if you're looking to do something.
Is there a question? There you go.
Up you come. You've got a big voice.
just toss him the mic.
Sorry, we're passing the mic.
You have a 20-minute delay every time.
Hello. I just wanted to pick up on something at the end of Phil's talk when he was talking about, sort of intimated about the reasons why the certain drop in female comp science majors in the States. I read a book a couple of years ago by Steven Pinker called The Blank Slate, where he pointed more to, I don't want to raise a huge debate here, but pointed to like the notion that equality of opportunity doesn't lead to equality of outcome. And the idea that you should be looking for 50% women or 50% black or 50% whatever is not the right approach. And in fact, I could say I was slightly offended. It wasn't really, but the idea that it's male intimidation, that we're all a bunch of sort of stockbrokers putting off women coming and joining our companies, I just don't buy that. And part of me thinks that maybe women just aren't choosing to do computer science, not because there's men doing computer science degrees, because it doesn't fit what they want to do. Just like we make decisions not to go into. So maybe there's certain types of industries. Maybe part of this is genetic. Do we have to worry about 50%? You know?
Well, I mean, strictly speaking, 50% of your customers are females, and so if 0% of your developers are able to address that market, then you've got a serious problem. So it's true. I mean, I wouldn't sit there and count heads or anything, but if you're turning your back on potential diversity of opinion in your development process, you've got a serious problem. In terms of, I kind of share your opinion that we're not scaring off people. You know, we're not used car salesmen. We don't have pictures of, horrible calendars up on the wall. But at the same time, I think there's something clearly wrong. It's probably happening much earlier than we're actually talking about here. It's probably education problems. It's probably something way earlier on. Like how many people are doing chemistry or calculus at high school? Is the percentages balanced all the way back there? And I just think that to say, oh well, there are more women teachers than there are male teachers, therefore who cares? It's just, some industries are different. We run the risk of cutting off potential contributions from valued people.
Yeah, and to address your point that perhaps women are just not choosing it, that's certainly the case right now, that they're not choosing it, but we have to ask ourselves, well, why? When you consider the first programmer was a woman, Ada Lovelace. Back in the 60s at IBM and other major companies, most of the programmers were women. There are a significant number of female programmers. Computers actually is a term that first described women who did the computations for, trajectories of bomb throwings or shootings, whatever.
Artillery.
Yeah, artillery. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. Bomb throwing. What kind of? Yeah. So that, my friends, is jet lag. But so the point though is that software development used to be a profession that had large numbers of women, and over time that decreased. And so I don't think you can rightly claim that, well, it's genetics or not well suited. I think that argument is bogus just based on history. I think what you can say is things like, and it's very, I think, I'm not trying to blame men and say, oh, we're all being, Neanderthals. What I'm trying to say is that there's very subtle things that happen that we don't see because, well, we're not the ones that are facing this, right? I've heard many stories of, for example, women in high school who their counselors say, oh, you shouldn't go into the engineering, you should look into marketing, or, these are the things, are these more crafts that are more well suited to you? And there's this underlying tone there that because you're a woman, and engineering is a men's field. And so it starts very early, but I think you'll find symptoms of this all the way through. I had many women comment on my blog post about how they're spoken to as if they're a child, or how male colleagues will get credit for their ideas. And it's well established, for example, that women make something like 80 or 70% on the dollar that every man makes who's of equivalent quality and experience. So clearly something is wrong here, and clearly it's an opportunity for us to fix it. I mean, we can sit here and try to assign blame to, men are awful, but that's really not what I'm interested in. What I'm more interested in is saying, well, can we address the root causes, and can we look at this as an opportunity to change the industry? And I'm also not trying to establish quotas. I'm not saying, well, it needs to be 50%. What I'm saying is that there's this artificial lowering of what seems would be natural based on history, and that ideally, if we can remove those blockers, we'll see a more natural distribution, whatever that may end up being.
Thanks, Phil. And I think the irony of there being an all-male panel talking about this is not lost on me or Ian. And I did actually mention that something about our own complacency in this, and we're aware of it. And next year there will be a next year, by the way. Yay! We'll be working on it. So, the question over here.
Hi. So, thanks for saying that about women. And I've, as a female developer, I'm lucky enough to have had a lot of respect from, people I've worked with and colleagues, male colleagues. So I guess I'm I'm one of the lucky ones. Also, just before my question, comment about what you guys talked about previously, I think what's really important is education at a much younger age on, at high school and even before that on what is a computer science degree, what is engineering, because so many people go into university not knowing what is software engineering, until they go into the first comp sci class and learn about Hello World. And it was kind of how I got into it, but luckily I stayed in it. But people just don't know what programming is, and a lot of boys might go, oh, I want to be a software developer because it sounds so cool, or I make a lot of money, but they don't really know what it's about until they actually do it. So if we create this awareness much earlier and sort of harvest this kind of, people, girls and boys who do well in analytical thinking or like that kind of thing, then maybe we get more girls into the profession. So Phil, your talk I found very inspiring, but I couldn't help thinking, what if, all of us here mostly are probably developers or, at employees, and it would be so good for the manager to actually be here to listen to what you said, because sure, we can bring back what you said to our managers, but they might just shake their heads or go, oh, yeah, that's a great idea, and not do anything about it. Also, how do you go from, if a person says, if a person comes out from university, I love coding, I love, it's fun, all the applications, all the experiments we did at university in robotics, it was so cool. But then in the real world, how many of us actually get to do that kind of job? And how many of us are slaving away programming sales orders for companies or changing their headers or, do you really give a shit about that, honestly? But that's the real world, right? That's how we make a living.
I think the question is how do I, or how do you apply the thinking that you've been talking about in an enterprise type role as opposed to a startup type role? Would you say? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, that's partly the question, and the question is, if you find yourself stuck in that and going from I love coding to I hate my job and I hate coding, would your advice be look for a new job?
Yeah, I think Cod said it earlier, find another job. It's one option. If you like your job and there's just a few things wrong, or a few things that are getting in the way, then obviously talking to your managers and trying to improve things and as much as possible, try to show them the evidence that look, let's give this a trial. I guarantee, according to all the evidence, we're going to increase productivity by reducing the number of work hours, as crazy as that sounds. I think if you look at 37 Signals, by all measures, a very successful company. They come out with the 4-day work week at some point, if I remember correctly, and so so they talk a lot about these principles, and so. And this is one of the reasons why, like I said, why I left Microsoft for GitHub, despite getting paid a ridiculous amount of money at Microsoft. I realized, and not that I'm not paid well at GitHub, I just want to be clear, but I realized that I was much happier making less money, but working in an environment where I had autonomy and mastery and control, purpose. And like you might be working on some system for billing that you find boring, but when you actually are able to talk to the customers and see the impact that your software makes, that can help provide purpose. It's not that you have to do rocketry, right? Rocketry and robotics, that can all happen in your spare time as well as a hobby, and there's a lot of aspects to what you find enjoyment in doing. But ultimately, I would say if you're not happy and you can't change your work environment, your existing work environment, then go find a new one. I don't know if you guys have anything to...
It's worth mentioning also that when we say go find another job, it doesn't mean you quit that day and then go and get by the paper or go online and look for the next job. I was in a very similar situation. I was in a situation just like that. I worked for the ambulance service in Australia, in Victoria, and I was there for 7 years as the only programmer from the age of about 21 through to 26, 27, 28. And I realized after 5 odd years that I wasn't going anywhere in this organization. I thought I was better than that. I had one program. I was the only guy, so I really couldn't learn much beyond what I could do myself during the time. And I started a long lead effort to find myself a better job, essentially, to improve myself, get myself known so that I could then make a side step or a big step up from where I was into something much better. And 2 jobs after that, I landed a job at Microsoft. So I went from ambulance to Redify directly to Microsoft. So sometimes it just requires you saying, this isn't working out for me. Sometimes it takes you 5 years to realize that, hey, I've just spent the best part of my 20s in this one job and I think I'm a little bit better than that. And then figuring out what do I need to do over the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to really get myself on the path to the job that I want to have, or at least in the next stage. And for me, it was, I lived in a regional town in Australia with about 80,000 people, so my exposure was fairly limited. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to travel the hour and a half to Melbourne once a month after work to go to the .NET user group. And I did that for 2 years, and during that time I met people, I got to know the presenters, most of them worked for Redify, the company I went on to work for. Finally suggested that perhaps I could do a talk talking about the stuff I'd built at Ambulance, and then very, very shortly after that I ended up sort of moving out and realizing I could work remotely for that company. And so, yeah, don't think that when we say, oh, go find another job if you don't like it, you have to do it straight away. It's not that daunting. You can really sit down and have a think about what is the next step where you would want to get to, and then what would you have to do to get there.
If I can add one more quick thing. At least in the U.S., despite the recession that we just went through, I was reading an article about how there's been a talent shortage, and it's very difficult to hire good developers right now. So the fact is, and your manager might not like to hear this, but we have all the power. And when you start making these demands and saying that, look, not only is it going to improve the work environment, but you're going to retain more people, I think you can force change in your organization. So because of that fact alone.
I think that one of the things that you need to bear in mind is that strategically speaking, and in the long run, if your job is building a horrible ordering system based on a functional spec which is given to you by someone, in 10 years' time, that job is going to be done in Chennai or Mumbai or somewhere cheaper than here. And so if you're wanting to have a long and rewarding career in the software industry, you can't be the people who are competing on, well, they use us because we just happen to be in the same building as them because we've always been in the same building as them. People will ask themselves that question eventually, so make sure that you've got sort of a slightly longer term view there. And part of that is having a reputation yourself. If you're just a cog in a wheel at a big company, then when you go for your next job, I've really got no way of knowing how good you are. Whereas if you're a cog in the wheel at the big company who spent an hour a day updating documentation or submitting fixes to an open source project, then when you apply for that job, at least I've got a vague idea who you are.
We're either really lucky or really unlucky as a profession that we can do this with very little resources, right? If you've got a computer at home, you can do this work at home, and that potentially will ruin your lifestyle, but it also but it also isn't it gives you immense power that you can work your job and you can work another job, do some rocketry at home, as Phil said.
So
okay, I've got a question. Changing tack a little bit, Microsoft actually released ASP.NET as an open source piece of software this week. Is that relevant? Does that matter?
I hope so. A lot of work, but this guy knows more about it than I did. But yeah, I think it's relevant. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I am the program manager for ASP.NET, the core runtime, and the stuff that ships in the .NET framework. The stuff that we released open source this week is not that. It's ASP.NET MVC, Web API, Web Pages, the Razor syntax, which is all the stuff we ship out of band. And in harsh reality, this announcement is, I think, fantastic. It's going to get a lot of coverage in a lot of various channels and blogs and tweets and whatnot. But the vast majority of our customers don't care. And I'm very happy to say that. I mean, we have literally millions of people who use ASP.NET. A small portion of those use the out-of-band stuff because it's only been around a couple of years compared to the 10 odd years the other stuff's been around. But that will change. What we don't want to do at Microsoft, in my view, is turn around in 5 or 6 years from now and go, wow, where did our 3 million customers go? We now have 500,000 customers. And that's a very real danger if we don't stay relevant. And if we look at our competitors in the sort of web development landscape, they're all either open source or going open source. The ones I care about. I mean, there are others as well, but we have a core group of customers who aren't going to change anytime soon, and we're going to continue to support them, obviously, and and continue to invest in the products that they use. But I absolutely think it's relevant. There's a small, a smaller portion of our customers that do care very much about this announcement, and I think that portion is only going to get bigger and never smaller. So,
I think the most important thing is that it will let the people who are stuck or chose to use ASP.NET MVC will be able to fix the bugs that they have. So I do some iPhone work as well, and whenever you hit a bug in the core framework, it's just like, well, I'm bugged, there's nothing I can do. I can report it, and then I wait for the next one, and I have to work around it. At least if it's an open source project, you have the ability to find the step through it in the debugger and not end up with just screenfuls of assembler, and then eventually you can fix it and kind of move on with your life. So I think in terms of productivity for their developers, it's going to make a huge difference if they're, culturally willing and able to do that.
Right.
Yeah, it's quite a shift in mindset, right?
Totally.
Especially, I work with a lot of open source stuff. I work in iPhone stuff where it's all closed, and if you submit a bug report, you really are. You forget about it because you're never going to hear back. And it is a shift in mindset when you work between those two. And so I guess that will just be happening in this community as well.
Okay, I think we've got another question from the floor down there.
Hi. I'm probably like a lot of developers here, and I've worked traditionally in an environment where you've had your CEO, like Phil said, your managers under him, then he's probably got managers under him, and then under them there's probably team leaders, then under them there's probably a senior programmer, and then there's normally me at the bottom, picking up all the pieces. You mentioned that in GitHub you work in a flat hierarchy now. I'm not sure how flat that is, or if it's more like rolling flat, but I was wondering if how you sort of deal with sort of issues that the other kind of hierarchy sometimes solves as far as sort of managing your projects or resolving conflicts maybe in your team, and you don't have that hierarchy in order to sort of escalate your problems and stuff. I was sort of wondering how that sort of works in a flattened hierarchy type situation. I'm not sure if maybe SourceSafe open source maybe has that same thing as well.
So with conflicts, we tell people to take a cement pill. And, no, I'm just kidding. In many respects, we don't have management like a traditional hierarchy, but on any project, someone sort of naturally rises and is the team lead, typically. It's very similar to an open source project where you might have the benevolent dictator or so on. But that person might change from project to project. It's not an established, like you are a manager, but it's more like, hey, I had this really great idea, I got some people to work with me, and I'm kind of, managing the process of getting this done. So it's more of an ad hoc, team by team basis, right? But like we don't report to the person, we don't have, like our, semi-yearly reviews. And in terms of conflict management, I actually haven't run into that yet. So, I think we just figure we're all decent people and we all like each other, and we're trying to, we just keep the lines of communication open so that if conflicts do happen, that we have some way to resolve it. Like, I don't think you need a parent or a manager to resolve conflicts. As a parent, one of the best advice I've heard when my kids are fighting is just let them fight. let them figure it out. Don't always interject yourself into that. So, like, if it works for my 4 and 2-year-old, I'm sure it can work for a bunch of adults at a company.
We've got one last question from the floor, and then we'll finish up.
I'm currently working for a small company, and we're quite spread out. And one of the problems I have is I usually spend a lot of time writing emails just to assign tasks and stuff. And I was wondering, how do you guys do remote work with workers? Because the biggest problems are time zones and also writing out lots of instructions. So.
I was just going to say, I worked remote before Microsoft. My last project I worked on, I was a remote worker for 18 months. I was in the same time zone as the rest of the team, but I was in Ballarat in Victoria in Australia, and they were in Sydney. I used a lot of Skype. I think I went through a gigabyte of data a day just leaving a Skype channel open all day. And we used, in terms of software development methodologies, we used pretty standard Scrum-like practices. So there weren't reams and reams of instructions that were required. There was, a bunch of user stories, and then a discussion that would take place whenever you were given a story with the relevant people. Having that open channel of communication was really important in that environment for us. When you start talking about alternate time zones, that asynchronous communication obviously becomes a lot more important. But I've heard varying opinions on this. I know a lot of people talk about even with the distributed workforce, it really helps to have at least some period where there is overlap between those people's normal, typical workday, even if it's just an hour, so that at least you can get that in-person sync up on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, I worked remotely for, I want to say like 5 years, but that's probably too long because I'm not that old. But most of my clients were on the west coast of the US. That level of, that time difference is 3 to 5 hours here. In my experience, it takes longer to start something, so there's a lot more faffing around in order to actually get everyone on the same page and agree, all right, so that's how we're going to do this, and that's when we're going to do this, and we're going to do it in this order. But then once you actually start rolling through and implementing those features, the fact that you've only got partial overlap is great. So I'd get up every morning, I'd interact with the people who they reported to me, give them some instructions, talk about how their day went, then they'd go home, and then I'd have the entire afternoon to just kind of code with no interruptions at all, which was just magic. So my advice, if you're doing distributed work and you're finding you're spending too much time on the sort of administrivia, is to have bigger projects bigger chunks would be my advice, so that you can spend a lot of time doing that kind of back and forth to kick something off, but then they can work for a week without really having to worry too much about what it is they're going to work on. Then the second part is, if you have a distributed team and you can't trust the other developers, like if the reason that you're giving them lots of instructions is because they're dumb, then you need different distributed developers. Because if you have a dumb person that's working next door to someone, you can reach over and keep an eye on them. You can't do that remotely, and it's just a disaster.
They need to be competent.
They need to be top notch.
Cool, thanks guys. So I wanted to finish on one question for people to take away. Monday, when I go back to work, what's the one thing I can do that I didn't do today to make myself a better developer? Who wants to go first?
Read other people's code. Okay. Seriously, the one thing that I really learned over the past couple of years is that I always felt intimidated looking at or thinking about learning some type of technology that I felt was far beyond my current capabilities. And what I inevitably found is that once I actually sat down for half an hour to read some of the code, I could usually get my head around it pretty quickly, and all that sort of trepidation melted away. So if you take that attitude into everything, it's certainly make you a better developer.
Generally speaking, I suggest that you should be curious. So whenever you've got a query that's slow, and you know that it's slow because it's using an order by and that doesn't have an index on the column that you're ordering by or whatever, it's not enough in my view to say, therefore I will add an index and it will be fast. If you don't understand why it is that when there's no index on that field, it is slow. So every time you find yourself going, and I do this thing because that's what I did last time, just say, but what's the actual root cause? Figure out how your source control system works, figure out how your database works, and as you slowly learn, you might find that the work that you're doing now as a web developer is not very interesting. You want to be doing you want to be a database guy, and it turns out that as you start figuring out how the stuff works, that's where you want to be.
I think something that I really like is to find things in your work to take pride in. So we talked before about perhaps doing some things that building your order management system or this sort of thing, and thinking, oh, there's nothing really here for me. But what we do when we create software is we make the life easier for other people. And I think when you see, it's especially why it's valuable to talk to customers and to talk to clients, because when you see how much this little thing that you did for them, you spent half an hour tidying something up for them, that suddenly it trims 2 hours out of their day. I think that's really powerful. It reminds you just how cool we can be.
Treat yourself well, right? Make sure you have a good chair, make sure you have the right equipment, and if there's things at work that sort of piss you off or get in the way of you being productive, stand up for what you need. It's not that you're being greedy; it's that these things are actually in the way of you getting even more done, more better.
That's awesome. Thanks, guys. Probably a round of applause for the panel. Thanks.